All right, let's bring in national editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, we've spoken at the top of the show, last sitting week. Some are even speculating it'll be the last time we see this current parliament sit. That's, of course, if the PM calls an election before it returns in February. We saw over the weekend the dramatic move by the government to pull its controversial misinformation legislation. I'm going to ask you, Dennis, is it dead or just deferred until after they win the election, as they hope?
Look, I think that this is a deferral. It is clear that Anthony Albanese wants to, just get rid of things that he can't pass. He's clearing the barnacles or, clearing the way through. What he wants is to get some clear air going into next year. We are expecting a parliamentary sitting in February. Certainly they've scheduled a budget for March, and certainly there has to be an election next year. So I think what we're seeing here is the government deciding what's difficult, what's too difficult, clear it away. What we can pass, we'll pass, and then just concentrate on going into the election next year without a whole range of distractions and legislation that's hanging about like a bad smell.
Well, he's still got plenty on his notice papers in the House and the Senate. There's 76 other bills there, 20 of which he's already said he wants to pick a fight with the Greens on. This is a free TAFE, electoral reform, nature positive, a whole bunch of other stuff. Are we seeing the Prime Minister, particularly after that result in Queensland where the Greens lost ground at a state level? We've seen some poor results for them at a council level in New South Wales and particularly even in socialist Victoria. Are we seeing the PM perhaps emboldened to take on the Greens? Do you think that's going to be a feature of the next few months?
Oh, I certainly think that we will see a real fight between the Greens and Anthony Albanese. There is no choice for the Prime Minister. Certainly, the Greens look weakened. Their radical position on Gaza has hurt them in some areas. Their lack of ability to actually seem to be doing deals. Today, they've done the housing deal. They've given Anthony Albanese a victory on his two housing proposals. But because they're in a weak position, this is what they have to do. But I think what we are actually seeing is a real war between the Greens and Anthony Albanese, because the Labor Prime Minister, he said he likes to fight Tories. He actually likes to fight Greens. He's been fighting Greens all his life. And his attitude is this: you give the Greens nothing and you take everything, because in the end, even as Adam Bandt said this afternoon, they're not going to support a coalition government and put in Peter Dutton over Anthony Albanese and a Labor government. They are always going to side with Labor. So Anthony Albanese is using the Greens' position to say, right, I'm just going to get my way on what I can. What you don't support, I'll embarrass you about. But he's also trying to dispel this idea, which is damaging to him and the Labor Party as a whole, that in fact what we're going to see after the next election is a minority Labor government and in coalition with the Greens. Look, no one particularly, there's a lot of people out there prepared to say this is the worst Labor government on record, or the worst since Whitlam, or even worse than Whitlam. But I don't think there's anyone out there who thinks that a Labor minority government controlled by the Greens would be better. And as Adam Bandt said this evening, after the housing policies, they waved the housing policies through, he said, we will wait till there's a minority government, and then we, that is the Greens, will introduce all of those property taxes, wealth taxes, via the Labor Party. So the Greens aren't going away. It's a very dangerous look for Anthony Albanese. He has to be seen to standing up to them, but they're still going to swap preferences and get each other elected at the next election.
I was going to make that point. I mean, he's an empty vessel. It'll be all sound and fury this side of the election. And you know how it goes. Of course, he'll do that deal on preferences. He'll talk tough, but he'll use the numbers from the Greens to get them over the line, the disciplined way they are. 80% of those Greens preferences floated through to Labor and slide back into the Lodge if he had his way.
Precisely. And some Liberal preferences actually elected Green MPs. Now, what Anthony Albanese really hopes to do is break the nexus between the political nexus, the appearance between the Greens and Labor, but at the same time actually win seats from the Greens. I think the Prime Minister reckons he can win 3, 4, maybe 5 seats from the Greens. That would ensure his majority government. So we've got a whole lot of things going on at once here, and Anthony Albanese is trying to pick on the Greens and use the Greens simultaneously.
All right, let's go to the Future Fund, because the fallout continues from those revelations last week by the Treasurer that the mandate of the fund, the investment mandate, returns of between 4 and 5% is the mandate, agnostic as to what the fund invests in, as long as it gets that sort of return. Well, now it's going to be about national priorities. So you know, the renewable energy agenda, social housing, all of that. A former Treasury Assistant Secretary, David Pearl, says Chalmers is now a serious liability for the Albanese government. Future Fund David Murray and Peta Credlin, both former chairmen, they've slammed the move. Now, the Treasurer says their criticisms are, quote, unhinged and ill-informed. Well, Dennis, I wrote a column about this in the Sunday papers. It had a huge response. Australians understand that this sounds very financially risky and self-interested, and particularly because Labor, previous Labor government, Rudd government, put Costello on it. They always thought this thing was beyond politics. And now it looks like a honeypot for Albanese and his mates. And I think, you know, reading the comments that I did, Australians are pretty angry about it.
I think Australians are very angry about it because what they can see is a grab for gold. It's the first and only Australian sovereign wealth fund. People don't understand quite the details of how it invests. By the way, it already invests indirectly in renewable projects. It has huge amount of money to invest. It is highly successful. It doesn't need change. And the Treasurer is saying, and this is the weakness in his argument, he's saying, oh, we've changed it to give priority to social housing, infrastructure and renewable energies. But then he's saying we haven't really changed it. No, everything's all right. Well, if everything isn't changed, why change it? The only reason he changed it is to try and get more investment into renewables and housing and infrastructure, all of the areas he described as the priorities for the government. Now, this is a question of priorities for any government of any political flavour. It is a mistake to change the priorities of the fund, and I think it will do huge damage in the public as well. They don't have to understand the financial niceties of it to see that this is a grab for gold from their nest egg.
You're not wrong, Dennis. And of course, if they're in renewable energy now, the fund, it's because it stacks up within that 4 to 5% band. If they're not in it, it's because it doesn't stack up. And to force them into the stuff that doesn't stack up, Australians can work that one out. Thanks for your time, Dennis. We'll speak again soon.